Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Before we begin, please ensure that you've opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note all audio connections are currently muted and this conference is being recorded. To ask a question via WebEx audio, please click the raise hand icon on your WebEx screen, which is located above the chat panel to the right. This will place you in the question queue. If you are connected to today's meeting via phone audio, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I will turn the webinar over to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs, Chair of the Market Surveillance Committee. Doctor, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks so much to the audience for joining us today. We're going to have two large agenda items on the resource efficiency evaluation initiative and energy storage enhancements. With me to discuss that are Dr. Scott Harvey and Jim Bushnell of the MSC, and I also have the privilege of staff members from the ISO joining us: Shami Davis, Greg Cook, Danny Johnson, Gabe Murtaugh, John Gooden, and Dr. Guillermo Bautista Alderete. So we're going to start this meeting, as we always do, by having open mic night. That is, if you'd like to say something or ask a question about any topic whatsoever, although if it's about today's topics, please hold those. Please queue up. So, Michelle, can you invite people to queue up on the phone?
Absolutely. So if you would like to enter a comment or a question, you may press the raise hand icon right above the chat box. This will put you into the question queue. If you're dialed in via regular audio, once again, pressing #2 will enter you into the comment queue. All right. Right now, I do not see any raised hands, Dr. Hobbs.
Okay, great. I'm sure we're going to get plenty of discussion later. I'm not worried about that. The first item that we'll be talking about today is the energy storage enhancements. I will summarize the conclusions of the opinion, and then the other members of the MSC may chime in, and then we'll open up the mic for questions and discussion from those of you who are on the phones, and then eventually we'll get around to considering adoption of the opinion. So first I'll summarize. The MSC was asked to comment on the energy storage enhancements proposal, which concerns market rules for short duration, typically 4-hour or less, battery-based energy storage facilities. This is in some ways a follow-up to the ESDR 4 initiative that I think that was a year and a half ago. It seems like forever, but at any rate, there are 4 components that we will comment on, and these deal with, first of all, improving the dependability of regulation that's been procured from battery storage. Second, the ISO's exceptional dispatch capability for storage and the compensation that it offers for exceptional dispatch. Third, the ability of owners of co-located storage to restrict recharging from the grid in order to protect the investment tax credits that they receive. And fourth and finally, the inclusion of an opportunity cost term in default energy bids that are to be used in the day-ahead market power mitigation process. Here are some observations and conclusions, not exhaustive, but I think that these are highlights. So first of all, about state of charge management for storage. that provides regulation. So we feel that an important issue with the present design for procuring regulation services is that the consequences of failing to deliver a regulation that was procured day ahead, the consequences of failing to deliver it in real time is simply a no-pay provision. You just have to claw back of what you were paid, rather than requiring that the resource buy back its day-ahead market schedule at the real-time price or penalty for regulation. The changes in this proposal, the changes that it makes to how regulation storage is handled, are really just addressing one manifestation of the broader underlying problem of the wrong incentive. Therefore, we're recommending that consideration be given to penalizing regulation non-performance based on the costs that the ISO would incur to replace that regulation, or the software's constraint relaxation penalty parameter for regulation, whatever applies in a particular market situation. Turning to the two particular provisions of the state of charge management. First, the proposal's recommendation that adjustments be made in the state of charge balance equations to account for expected discharge and charge of energy associated with deployment, possible deployment of regulation up and down. These are reasonable initial approximations. They're a first step that should lessen the likelihood that real-time states of charge will reach levels that make it infeasible to actually deploy the procured regulation. But there's always uncertainty about what will happen in a particular day. And there might be much bigger or much smaller changes in state of charge. So for that reason, because there are these risks, and in real-time situations may be quite different than the average, we also support the proposed requirement of minimum levels of charging bids and minimum discharge energy offers in real time to accompany regulation up and down respectively that has been procured day ahead. We think the requirement is needed to ensure that state of charge levels can be maintained that ensure feasibility of deploying the procured regulation. We would like to see more data. And it could be that that data will justify values other than the average values for changes in the state of charge. For example, if the consequences of being on one side versus the other, being short or being long, are significantly worse than being on the other side, then you will want to bias that coefficient. But that will take more data. And likewise, determination of whether those coefficients should depend on system conditions, whether changes in state of charge are found to be very different, say, under system stress conditions than at other times. But that will take more data, and we hope that the ISO will look at that data and be ready to make appropriate changes. The second feature is exceptional dispatch storage resources. That too has two elements. The first is to expand the range of exceptional dispatch tools for storage that are available to operators so they can directly specify minimum states of charge for storage. We think that making this tool available is likely to improve system reliability and giving the operators greater assurance that the needed states of charge will be available for critical evening peaks. We also support the second element of this part of the proposal about exceptional dispatch, and that would compensate storage for ED by calculating foregone revenues through a double counterfactual approach, making two simulations of after the fact, after the day, of how you would have used the storage without the exceptional dispatch and then with the exceptional dispatch, and then look at the differences in revenue. This is quite a departure from the ISO's general approach to bid cost recovery, which basically just says, you know, we're not going to let you lose money compared to your as bid costs. And you can ask us about it, but we don't think that's appropriate here. But because it is a departure and it's something new that the ISO hasn't gotten experience with, yeah, the ISO is going to want to monitor the performance of this very closely and be on their tiptoes, and ready to jump left or right to make changes, especially if strategic behavior emerges, which we think is a possibility, although we haven't identified particular forms that might take. Number 3 is about co-located storage and variable renewable supply resources. So naturally, we're disappointed that the investment tax credit provisions of the present tax code that applies to a lot of co-located or hybrid facilities has a potential to hobble the ISO's ability to use that storage to maximize system reliability. There are a lot of studies that show that restricting charging to times when the co-located renewable facility is generating definitely puts a limit at certain times on the contribution to the system be able to meet load. We recognize and we're glad that the tax law is changed under the Inflation Reduction Act, that this may be less of an issue in the future because of the use of production tax credits rather than investment tax credits. And we are suggesting that, first of all, the ISO and the CPUC assess the impact on resource adequacy contributions by such resources and make appropriate adjustments. And second, consideration could be given in the future to providing economic incentives for co-located facilities to grid charge, rather than the provision of this proposal, which just basically says the facility can say, don't grid charge me, period, no matter what the system conditions are. The calculation of the foregone investment tax credit and so forth is something in theory could be done. It might be complicated, and perhaps this is in practice not such an issue that it's worth bothering doing that. But we are agreeing with DMM's comments on this, at least in theory, that it's something that should be attractive if this is indeed a practical issue. Number 4, market power mitigation in the day-ahead market. It's something we spent a lot of time on in our ESDR 4 opinion, and it rears its ugly head again here. As DMM and staff have pointed out, as well as stakeholders, some funny things can happen with the hour-by-hour mitigation process, interval by interval, in that you mitigate discharge offers in some hours, but not in others, and that can completely mess up the charge and discharge schedule and move it much further rather than closer to optimality. So we have in general, the overall system of local market power mitigation for storage and the overall system of DEBs in the day-ahead market, we judge that it's likely to be ineffective in addressing possible market power that could be exercised by storage. And this is mainly because the system doesn't address bids to charge, and it's the resulting bid-offer spread that largely determines how you use storage, and that can be, under the present LMPM system, can be readily manipulated to economically withdraw storage from the market at the time that the system needs storage for economic and reliability reasons. If you don't touch charging bids, that's unfortunately what's going to happen. Now, given that there's an absence of publicly available data on the frequency and magnitude of mitigation of storage market power in the day-ahead market, and there's, in general, not a great deal of understanding of how storage can affect the efficiency of ISO markets and payments in ISO markets, how storage can affect it through the exercise of market power, we can't assess whether the revised day-ahead default energy bids in the proposal will result in market power mitigation whose benefits to consumers will outweigh the schedule inefficiencies that might still result. But we do agree that the problems identified by staff and DMM are indeed problems, and at least it should do no harm. And so this is a correction that needs to be made, but we're still left with a market power mitigation system that we think would be ineffective if there is indeed market power. We doubt that mitigation's benefits exceed the costs of inefficient schedules for smaller storage facilities. So the ISO in the future could consider raising the safe harbor limit of 5 megawatts to exempt larger storage facilities. I'll close with the following. As we noted in our opinion in ESDR 4, the economically most efficient way to reflect opportunity costs that arise from purchases and sales in the day-ahead market is for the charge bids and discharge offers to exclude opportunity cost components arising from day-ahead sales and purchases. And just let the day-ahead software automatically calculate those costs by considering states of charge, prices, operating limits, round-trip efficiencies, etc., over the 24-hour horizon. I'm assuming that we give appropriate recognition of the value of stored energy in the last period at midnight for the next day. But if, first of all, that recommendation is not acceptable to the ISO and the stakeholders, and if, second, market power for storage is a potential concern, and third, if the ISO wants to effectively mitigate that market power, then we believe it's essential to carefully consider the entire 24-hour profile of bids and offers and how mitigation decisions affect operations. So being able to exercise market power in one interval should perhaps be responded with mitigating both bids and offers, that is the spread, in several or even all intervals. This would be a complicated undertaking. We recognize that. And it's not obvious that this would be worth the effort. And there's certainly not time to design such a feature in the present energy storage enhancements proposal. But we hope it should be revisited in the future, particularly if there arises evidence that storage can exercise local market power. Okay, so thanks for listening to all that. And I'll first ask if Jim or Scott have anything they want to add.
Nothing from me at this point.
Scott, that was good, Ben. That was very complete.
Okay, thanks. And of course, the contributions to the rest of the committee, I really appreciate Scott and Jim, your help in that. This is a committee effort. So Michelle, I think we're ready to go to the phone lines in case there are any questions or comments.
All right, one moment. Cool, go ahead. Your line's unmuted.
Good afternoon. This is Elvis Svoboda from PG&E, and appreciate an excellent summary, Ben, of the overall opinion, and in particular, my comment and question has to do with the first part, and you put front and center the element of your opinion that I have qualms about. I think PG&E has expressed support for the changes that the ISO is planning, so I don't think there's any controversy about that. But the assertions you've made in a couple places, and as has the DMM, about market participants' ability to manage state of charge when they're providing regulation, I would really like to present a scenario at least to you, and then and ask in a little bit better color on what you think a market participant should do than just simply, which I think you do state clearly, you think price offers should basically be increased for regulation to reflect the risk of imbalances. But I think the issue we have is we've seen patterns of the way regulation is taken that are obviously they're not predictable, but they can be repeated over periods of multiple days and then potentially change. Our issues have had a lot more to do with the case in which reg down is causing batteries to charge to their maximum state of charge over the course of a day. And so essentially we have there's a high risk that at some point during the day, if a resource is providing full regulation down, it will go to maximum state of charge, and there will be imbalance risk that occurs at that point in time. We can't predict what that point in time is, and we can't predict what the cost of charging is going to be that we will be assessed for that regulation. And so the question is sort of so basically, and also I should point out, and I think this is the case for most batteries, we are in a situation where generally the default assumption is that the battery is providing flex RA. In that case, the battery has to bid its full regulation capability up and down in all hours. And so the only control that we actually have on the bid is price, right? And the only way we can attempt to withhold regulation in hours where we don't think it's economic is to bid at a very high price. And essentially, it appears to me that what you're proposing is a bidding process in which market participants are picking and choosing hours in which they want to regulate based on when they think that would lead to the lowest cost of sort of the net cost of charging that's involved in providing that regulation. But that is going to interact with how other market participants similarly assess the situation. It's not really based on, and also on the non-transparent nature of the regulation energy. So it's not based on necessarily any hourly value that can be forecast with any accuracy. And in my mind, the process becomes very reminiscent of penalty kicks, where essentially you're choosing an hour and hoping everybody else chooses another hour so that you get your value in that hour, and then you're able to properly manage your state of charge over the course of the day so that you don't go into an area where currently you would be excluded from getting bid cost recovery for the imbalance costs. So I'd like maybe Scott to sort of describe what he thinks is and not in the sense of a strategy, but what's a reasonable way to approach that problem, because in my mind, it's very difficult to do, and it's not the sort of simple process of managing state of charge that you're describing. The uncertainty about what the reg takes are going to be is so great. Thanks for listening to that diatribe. I appreciate it.
Scott, if you could, I'll definitely want to hear what Scott has to say, but just quick clarification, Alva. So when you first said that you were first emphasizing what seemed to be, were you suggesting that requiring these bids when actually you may be, for example, in the case of reg down, when the facility is nearly full, it's overkill to require that to have those offers to sell. Offers to buy, because that would be it's simply you're nowhere near the constraint, and so you is that what you're concerned about? Is overkill?
As I said, I'm not objecting to any part of the ISO's proposal. I think that the steps that they're proposing are reasonable to give the ISO more control in making sure that resources don't hit their limits when they're providing regulation. What I'm objecting to is several statements in the opinion that appear to indicate that market participants can manage their state of charge simply through a single set of price bids on regulation. And in a sense, I'm just asking you to either appreciate the difficulty of that problem, or perhaps provide a better suggestion as to how you think that should be addressed, given, you know, I mean, and maybe Scott's suggestion is going to be buy a hedging instrument, but that's not kind of the direction in which I'd like to get as a you know, somebody looking at a source of supply in a market where cost ultimately is supposed to be reflected in the solution.
You know, so my impression is, in one sentence, is that the intention is to have some bids or offers in there rather than none. I don't think anybody's anticipating that there'd be a, you know, these would be very finely tuned, in perhaps the sense that you're suggesting. But if there are no offers, then that's a problem. But I think I heard you say that if this is Flex RA, they will have put in offers.
Yeah, they're required to
So
put in
that's
full
not the issue.
offers, full offers
Okay.
of their capability in all hours. And remember that the ancillary service bid is a single price. There's no ability to differentiate, you know, along the quantity axis of the ancillary service bid. So this is it's a dilemma that I see with this suggestion, and the DMM made the same suggestion in its sort of saying we're going to disallow bid cost recovery. The suggestion that you know, battery operators can easily predict what CAISO is going to do with their batteries when they're on regulation seems false to me.
Scott?
Well, it's not clear, you know, we obviously don't know how you're bidding and how everybody else is bidding, but you know, when we look at the heat wave report, for example, we can see that during the peak hours, the high net load hours, that there's a whole lot of regulation bid up bid and virtually no regulation down bid. And that is a strategy which will inevitably result in the resource being depleted because it's never charging back. And the storage operator has the ability to manage that by offering both regulation up and regulation down. And it also is, as the CAISO has talked about, and as requiring in real time, you know, the storage operator could put in energy offers to so that the resource would be able to be recharged. So, you know, but we've asked the CAISO for more clarity about exactly what the problem is and to what extent the people that are running out of state of charge up or down are storage operators that have only offering regulation down or only offering regulation up. It seems to me that anybody that's doing that is clearly going to, you know, they're basically just, you know, storing energy while being paid to provide regulation and selling energy while being paid to provide regulation. And then they run out. And if they
If the
penalty
bids are
price,
structured
I don't
that
think
way.
they bid that way.
But even if you bid, you know, fully in both directions, and even if you bid economically in both directions, the fact is that the pattern of regulation take is not as you describe. It doesn't lead to a balanced solution. And in fact, our observation in this, it's locational, so it's not the same for all parts of the system. But we've had you know, cases in which we had full awards in both directions, and regulation up was not taken, and in any meaningful amount. You know, essentially, you'd look at like a 1% energy take or something, and regulation down was taken over multiple hours at a very high level of take, because that's apparently what the ISO needed over the course of multiple hours. And it seems to be sometimes systematic and sometimes not. But we don't have that ability to necessarily get a balanced state of charge result out of balanced regulation awards. I don't think that's true.
Yep, that may be the case, Alva, but you know, it's clear in the heat wave report that people aren't submitting balanced offers.
Right, and there can
And
be cases.
I can certainly see how unbalanced offers are going to result in people running out. Now,
I agree,
it
and I
seems
think
to me that the problem you're describing is the kind of issue that the CAISO is addressing with the requirement for the energy offer, that even though, you know, the new rule about the day-ahead market is going to try to result in schedules that on average are going to be right, the CAISO recognizes that they're not always going to be right, which is why, you know, they need the energy offers to top it off. So
yeah,
that when you
I
get
I
down,
agree. I agree.
Okay.
I just think let's assume that people are providing balanced bids. I think even in that case, state of charge may not be managed for a particular resource. And your language is that they can essentially escalate the bid in order to cover that risk. I'm not sure that's the appropriate way to handle this problem, because it's a problem of how the ISO regulates, really. It's an unpredictable and non-transparent problem of how ISO regulates, rather than something that can be predicted by the market participant.
Yep, I agree. You know, to the extent there's more to unpack here and understand this, I think we need to, but I think that, you know, the ISO's offer is requiring energy bids is consistent with what, you know, a resource should do itself to try to manage its energy state, is to have energy bids that could be used to sell off the energy when it reaches a full state of charge. And, you know, one of the things that the MSC talked about for years, which is state of charge dependent offers, would resolve this, because when you got full, if your state of charge offer was that when we get really full, we want to offer at a lower price, but that got backburnered out of this process. And,
Right.
you know,
Well, it's a completely
that's
different
one of
market.
the things that would be, seems to me, would address this, that you could put in state of charge dependent energy offers that were combined with your reg down offers that would discharge energy when you started getting full.
Yeah, and that's a helpful direction. I just think you know, we're faced with a period of years where we're going to be dealing with the current model, basically.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really bad outcome that we, you know, I don't agree with the choice to make it a period of years. I thought that should have been part of this proposal, but that's what was decided.
Yeah, I mean, initiatives take time. Anyway, thank you very much, Scott. I really appreciate your response on your points.
Thank you, Alva. Michelle, we can go to the next person on the queue.
Yes. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Thank you. This is Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. I just had a couple comments about the co-located resources with the ITC restrictions. I think your paper talks about, you know, potential adjustments to the RA value for those resources, and you know, there is, for the CPUC jurisdictional entities, the CPUC does adjust the storage counting for the co-located resources, you know, looking at expected amount of solar production and making sure that there's enough to fully charge the resource 2 hours prior to the start of the net load peak period. So they adjust, potentially, depending on the size of the storage relative to the solar resource, they potentially reduce the storage counting. And then they also reduce the solar counting by the amount of the charging energy. So they're, in a way, they are making some kind of accommodation for those co-located resources with ITC restrictions. Now, whether it's the right accommodation, you know, I think you could argue it. And then you suggested that either the ISO or the CPUC do some kind of assessment of the performance of co-located resources versus standalone storage. And I fully support that. I think it should probably be the ISO who does it, because the ISO would have the data, more data than the CPUC. But I actually would like it probably for a different reason, which is I suspect that we may be discounting these resources more than we should, because there ought to be a really high correlation between the times when the market should want to charge storage and the amount of solar production. You know, the more solar production, the more charging. And so I think in those periods where the solar's not available, even if it's unexpectedly not available, those are probably the times when you don't want to be charging anyway. And I would hope that an analysis of this would reveal that and maybe inform the appropriate counting that's attributed to these resources.
Right, yeah. So compared to, say, the Pacific Northwest, where winter peaks are of concern, that where that might be a much more important phenomenon, that precisely when you need energy and storage for the evening, you have no solar. So, Doug, what I hear you saying is that there are some adjustments now, whether they are the correct adjustments, either too much or too little, is not quite clear. So, and I hear you supporting that, in general, this, the actual data and performance should be looked at. So definitely appreciate you mentioning that.
Great, thank you. And then I just had one other comment about the market power, and I really appreciated the discussion about the need to continue to evaluate the potential exercise of market power, particularly the idea to think about the spread and concerns about charging, market power in the charging direction, not just in the discharging. This has been a concern of mine for a while, and I don't think we have measures in place to address this other than maybe exceptional dispatch if people were abusing the situation.
Okay. Thank you for reinforcing that point. I appreciate that, Doug.
Thank you.
Okay. Michelle, we can go on to Kathleen.
Kathleen, go ahead.
Great, thanks. Oh, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to thanks for going over your opinion and kind of the back and forth. I think your back and forth with Alva really highlights how complicated of a problem this is and how much we're learning. If I can, just on that flag, Scott, you referenced the heat wave analysis from this past September and kind of what you saw there. I'm sure we're not the only people who have asked the CAISO and kind of responded to that event and said, hey, we should slow down a little bit and spend some time looking into the data in a more detailed way, providing you more data, providing stakeholders more information on how the battery fleet operated, and really dig into some of these complexities so that we can move forward in a very rational way and propose something that gets at these problems. So I wanted to just let you know that we reacted to that the end of August, beginning of September time period as, wow, this is, we have federal policies that were released from some of the federal rulemakings. We've set up the non-generator resource model. We've done multiple, I think, Ben, you referred to, this is as coming out of ESDR 4. We've done a lot of work on it, but that's the first time, at least in my opinion, the first time that we have truly seen the storage fleet and enough of a size be stress tested within the market, seeing the non-generator resource model truly stress tested in a way that I believe we unsurfaced some edge cases. We normally just debate what edge cases exist rather than get the opportunity to see the data. And so in our mind, it would have been more prudent for the CAISO to have allowed for more analysis and discussion, especially into the interplay of ancillary services and energy offers. We saw a lot of interesting things that we think merit more discussion. That I hope provides a little context for why Vistra is in a position where we think that this project, at least the ancillary service elements, being taken to the board is vastly premature. And also we think that it will lead to adverse outcomes for the market, which we've raised with staff. And we've raised them in our comments. I wanted to make sure that the MSC was aware that it's not that we are, it's not that we're trying to push for a favored proposal. It's that we think a lot was learned over the last few months. We are even more convinced that there are challenges in the interplay between energy and ancillary services, and we do not think these proposals address that. And it's not enough for us, for the CAISO, to say, well, we might tackle this in a future initiative. We think the size of storage is too large. That event was too impactful. Where we sit right now is not enough to put something forward and say it might work but it might cause problems. But let's try to see if it fixes some things. And if it raises other challenges with operating the storage, you'll have to wait a couple years for another initiative to propose a solution. And just to highlight what we mean by that, and I know we've spilled a lot of detail in our last iteration of comments, and we've spoken with on the call, so I don't want to belabor this, but the ancillary service proposal that revises the stated charge calculation, but does not propose changes to the ancillary service stated charge constraint, we believe at best will lead to market inefficient outcomes, and at worst, in real time, might be infeasible kind of circular logic in the market model, because the stated charge calculation will now assume an expected use for regulation, but the ancillary stated charge calculation is going to require the asset hold stated charge to meet 50% without any changes. And in the day ahead, the constraint will require 100%, but the stated charge calculation will be reduced and not necessarily have that stated charge in the calculation because it's being proposed to be removed. We're not against the CAISO talking about changing the stated charge calculation. We have consistently said it cannot be discussed separate from the AS stated charge constraint, and that it's essential that the scope address the interplay between the stated charge and the constraints that includes that term, which the CAISO has not done. I think we've been encouraged to think of this as an implementation issue, but I think it's a tariff element potentially where a tariff needs to be revised. And this is something I'm raising to you because I truly believe it will lead to inefficient or infeasible outcomes. And I think it's not in the best interest of the market. So I want the MSC to be aware.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. And I just wanted to clarify that your concerns extend to both elements of this part of the proposal, both the required energy bids and offers, as well as the adjustment to the stated charge, or are you focused mainly on the adjustment to the stated charge, which is what you were just talking about?
Yeah, our primary concern is the adjustment to the stated charge calculation without the accompanying changes to the constraint, because we think it will have actual harm. The second issue on the overlapping energy and AS bids, I think the CAISO did not identify the problem, and I think we don't know if this will actually address the problem that they're trying to scope. And it's just clear that it's premature. They weren't able to answer pretty specific questions stakeholders raised them. Well, what's the issue? Can you show us data? Can you explain what the operators were facing? And we didn't get much information, which kind of says to me that the problem statement hasn't been scoped. So, while I can't make the same statement that I think it will lead to direct harm. I will say that I think it limits the flexibility of the assets being made available to the market, and that if it is implemented and we monitor it, I would anticipate it would look like it is reducing the efficiency of the market solution because of the limited flexibility of the assets. But that is something that I think we could live with it and monitor, but the adjustment to the stated charge we think will actually harm the market. So we can't live with that.
And the issue with the adjustment of the stated charge is that you feel that similar provisions should be made for other ancillary services, SPIN, notably, and you feel that the absence of an adjustment for deployment of SPIN could result in unintended consequences or interactions if regulation has such an adjustment, but SPIN does not. Is that in a nutshell what you're saying?
No, so let me clarify. So the ancillary stated charge constraint, which is the constraint that's both in the day ahead and the real-time market. Day ahead, it'll kind of change what your awards look like between energy or AS. But in real time, it'll actually send you, right, if you have insufficient stated charge, it will send you an energy award to move you to meet that constraint. Has a left-hand side and a right-hand side. You have to have certain amount of charge on the bottom part of your range and a certain amount on the top part of your range to meet your ancillary service obligations, a portion of it in real, the 50%. That 50, so what I'm saying is that that constraint requires 50% of your regulation up or regulation down award to be maintained, to be held in your stated charge capability in reserve.
Mm-hmm.
The term that is included in that constraint to see if you're meeting that obligation in the market is the stated charge calculation with the proposed change. So if I'm taking that stated charge that term, and I'm now reducing it based on the multiplier times that reg up award, which is a different percent than 50%, I do not believe that that constraint will always be feasible, and it will then send either inefficient, uneconomic energy awards in real time, and or in day ahead, it'll limit your awards and kind of send in, you may result in different levels of energy versus regulation being awarded out of the day ahead. That is also inefficient because remember, in day ahead, that constraint requires 100%, not just 50%. So 100% of reg up must be in the stated charge capability, but your stated charge is going to be reduced by your reg up award.
Right. Okay. So the major issue is not the interaction with the other ancillary services. Is that? Am I understanding what you're saying? I'm just trying to pin.
You are correct. It is the interaction with the constraint that requires a different. It has a different value. So, like, if the CAISO would have proposed something in a holistic way, it would have looked something like a multiplier times the regulation award being included in the stated charge calculation, and then the percent in the constraint left-hand side and right-hand side terms would have been changed to be the multiplier. But they weren't changed, and they're being maintained at 100% for day ahead and 50% in real time. But the term is now going to have a different multiplier.
Okay, this is when a blackboard would have been very helpful. So if I understand, this says this we've talked about this before, and I'm wondering whether if it's okay if I can invite Gabe, if you would like to say something at this point about the difference between what's proposed in the ESE proposal and what Kathleen is suggesting instead, and the practical implications of that, and the relationship to the problem that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I know we've had some discussions in the past, and we had, kind of George Angelides come to one of the workshops that we had, and sort of, I mean, I think the objective there was to sort of allay some of these fears that we may be, doing something that would result in a, not being able to generate a solution, because that was certainly one of the pieces of feedback that we've gotten. I think, inefficient market outcomes are sort of an inherent byproduct of any time you enforce any constraint on the market. So certainly, you enforce a constraint on the market, and your solution gets further from, the purest, most efficient solution you could arrive at. I think that I don't want to, I agree with you, Ben. I think sitting down and writing this out on the blackboard or a whiteboard could be really helpful, because maybe there is something that I'm missing and some others here at the ISO are missing. But I think, the point of the policy that we're putting forward here is to try to address this problem that some storage resources sometimes actually don't have stated charge. And when they actually don't have state of charge, they can't provide ancillary services. And when that happens, that really does put our operations team in a difficult situation in real time as, you know, things are actually happening on the grid. And, you know, obviously we all are aware that some of these storage resources can be very large and can therefore make up a very large portion of the amount of regulation that the ISO is carrying during any particular hour. So not to have or be able to rely on a portion of that could be, you know, it could have real reliability implications for the market. And that's really why we want to tackle this and tackle it so quickly and get it done in this initiative. But, you know, I think we're all aware that, you know, we're still learning about storage resources. They're still relatively new on the market. We want to, you know, get some of that feedback, do more of the data analysis with these constraints in place, thinking about how we could potentially relax them going forward, because we don't want to impact and interfere with storage resource operations when we don't need to. We only want to do this when it's absolutely critical. But the feedback that we're getting from our operations team right now is saying that this is a problem. This is really important that we address it. And, you know, I have had conversations with senior management, and I think one of the things that our operations team has even raised is the possibility of potentially excluding storage resources from providing all regulation. Now, obviously I don't want to go down that route, and when storage resources are able to provide regulation, they do it very effectively. But I think it really does underscore how important this issue is and how concerned our operators are if they can't rely on, you know, a particular class of resources, even, you know, a handful of times, you know, during a week, you know, a handful of hours, something like that. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I think it's very helpful, Gabe. But I mean, when I think about this, I think the CAISO has shown we've got problems with resources that don't have state of charge up and they don't have resource state of charge down, so they can't provide regulation that they're supposed to. And I think that's been shown. The only ambiguity is, you know, how exactly can we fix it and what are all the factors contributing to it? But it isn't efficient to be paid for a service you're not providing and can't provide because you've run down your state of charge and there's no consequences to it. And, you know, it goes back to the point we talked about that I expect people to be trying harder to avoid this outcome if they had to buy back their schedules at a penalty price. And this is I view this as an interim step to control this, but I do think we need to look more at penalty prices. And as we talked about with Alva, better methods for, you know, some of these state of charge dependent energy bids that could be used to recharge storage resources.
Yeah, and I definitely don't want to pass the buck here, but we certainly can't cover that in the scope of this initiative, which is just focused on storage resources. I think one of the places where we could potentially tackle this is in the price formation initiative, you know, which we've teed up and we're starting work on. So I certainly would like to renew this conversation in that venue, and I think that's the appropriate place to address it.
I know this one's too far along to add things, but it should have been addressed here, not put off into 3 years in the future. But anyway, that's.
No, I agree with that, Scott. I just wanted to, I feel that these conversations often go to where you and Gabe just went, of this very high level problem statement, which I want to be, I hope you're hearing me that Vistra is supportive. We are supportive of looking at this problem. We ourselves see issues and challenges and so we think this is a really important problem. Our concern is incredibly practical, and the concerns we've been raising are very practical. We have a 400 megawatt storage asset. We are not talking about small impact to our fleet. And so, like, I am very practically just raising that there is a circular nature between two constraints in the market that include a proposed change that we think is going to lead to market outcomes that are potentially infeasible. And I know George tried to explain that's not infeasible, as in the market won't time out and failed to solve, which I agree, it may not fail to solve, but it may need to produce a result that has a greater myth gap error. It may need to produce a result that is less effective because it will have to work harder to try to solve this constraint that is now being impacted by circular logic. So our concern is incredibly practical. We've asked the CAISO to engage with us on this level. I'm not trying to have the 100,000-foot conversation. I'm trying to have the practical, will the market produce market outcomes that are inefficient and infeasible from my perspective, as in it's highly inefficient, could really lead to outcomes that are uneconomic relative to what they should be leading to without this circular logic. That's what I mean by that. And it's not something that, you know, we can stand by and allow and support. And I just wanted to make sure that the record in the stakeholder process and with you, because it's a market inefficiency issue, was really clear that this isn't about a policy problem. This is about proposing something that has not been fully stakeholdered and the proposal isn't complete. The other thing on the offers, the energy and the AS, just so you know, like we have tried to have with multiple CAISO staff productive conversations. I honestly think that a path forward to solve that problem that is much more efficient and closer to what some of what the other stakeholders who've commented already mentioned, that there's issues with the regulation logic and it being a black box. AGC logic could have been discussed. There are ways by which the AGC automatic generation control regulation signal determines what is the best resources to send the regulation signal at any given point in time. Every asset on regulation is not receiving an AGC signal to move at all points in time. And you know what? I think that there are improvements to that black box signal that would be using the stated charge in a more managed, a better managed way through the AGC signal, similar to how the real-time market uses the AS stated charge constraint to maintain a certain portion of charge to meet the signals. The AGC signal could better manage the stated charge if it's sending that. It would require us stakeholdering it, discussing it with the technical teams, and vetting it, but that should have been an opportunity made available to us as we made suggestions, and it wasn't. And so these elements just were not stakeholdered sufficiently. They have not been vetted, and I think that's why if you see stakeholder opposition, I hope it makes more sense why. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'd like to ask Gabe just a quick question. So in previous discussions of the issues that Kathleen has raised, have there been work through examples of situations where indeed there could be problems? I mean, this is sort of the endearing stakeholder process way of doing things, is that we work through simple examples to illustrate how things work and what problems can arise. Has there been an example, hypothetical examples that have identified the type of problems, whether circular logic or others that Kathleen has identified, or are those, have we not seen any examples like that? Has nobody offered examples of numerical examples of problems, even if hypothetical?
Yeah, we've certainly heard, verbal descriptions of possible concerns, but I haven't seen any numerical examples. And we did, the ISO presented at one of the workshops, I believe, some examples of how some of these, numerical examples of how some of these constraints would work together. Obviously, they were very high level and simplistic, but we did kind of go through those. And I don't remember hearing or seeing any presentations on, if the numbers look like this, this could cause, some sort of a circular issue in the solution.
Okay. All right. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be such a problem, but that would have, I think, helped the discussion if indeed these concerns could be the circularity or whatever could be a problem if there were numerical examples, because something very concrete then can be responded to, and we could see what it is about the formulation that is either causing a problem or has perhaps not been well communicated. So my other question, Gabe, so let's say a problem arises. Is this sort of is a problem like that something to be dealt with in a BPM change, or is it going to be much more difficult because it involves a tariff change? Just wondering how the ISO would respond if something, if what Kathleen is afraid of does actually occur, how quickly we could respond to correct that or deal with it.
Yeah, Ben, I think like most things, it's a complicated answer. It depends, I think to the extent we possibly can, we'd like to build a lot of these formulations in the BPM. I think some of the time we have to include at least a description of some of these constraints in the tariff. And obviously, once you include it in the tariff, then it requires a much deeper and prolonged process to make changes. But, I would say that if there really were concerns where, our market was just not dispatching storage resources the way it should be, like the example with the ancillary service state charge constraint initiative, the ISO can move quickly to make those kind of corrections if necessary. Obviously, we don't want to have to do that,
Right.
but if it's necessary, we can.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Jim Scott, you want to say anything else on this issue before we have a last check of the lines? I don't see anybody in queue, and I might be getting a text here telling me if somebody's in queue. Yeah, Michelle, is there anybody in queue?
There is currently no one in the queue.
Okay, all right. Okay, so at this point then I'll conclude the discussion and we'll move to consideration of the opinion. So I would like to entertain a motion to adopt the opinion on energy storage enhancements.
All right, I move to adopt the opinion.
I second the motion.
Okay, it's been moved by Dr. Bushnell and seconded by Dr. Harvey that the opinion be adopted. Let me check to see if there any changes or anything else that anybody would like to say about this before we have a vote.
I'd just like to explain, as we stated many points in the opinion, that we don't view that these changes solve all the problems with storage and that the CAISO should shut down and not worry about anything. There's a lot of things that need to be fixed, and these changes can be fine-tuned, and our view was that we needed to make some of these changes, but there's more to be done.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Scott. And I share that opinion, certainly. Okay, if there's nothing else that anybody would like to say, it's been moved and seconded, and I would like to therefore have a vote as to whether the opinion on energy storage enhancement should be adopted. Jim?
Yes.
And Scott?
Yes.
And I vote yes, and so the opinion has been adopted unanimously. Thanks to everybody on the phones for your contributions to the discussion in the last hour, and indeed the discussions over the last 2 or 3 years on energy storage issues. And as Scott suggested, we need to and expect to be talking further in the future about these issues and others with storage. So at this point, we're going to shift over to the resource sufficiency evaluation opinion, which a version of this opinion was considered in a meeting in October, but at the time that the meeting was scheduled, let's see it, Shortly before the meeting took place, the ISO decided to defer the bringing it to the board until the December board meeting, and to consider some changes, and some changes have indeed been made to the proposal. So now we have, we did not adopt an opinion at that time, and the opinion that you see in front of you is based to a great extent on the previous opinion, but it's been changed to reflect the revised ISO proposal. And I'd like to hand the virtual mic over to Jim to present the opinion.
Yeah, I was going to ask if we should take a short break, but I think since we're running a little late, maybe we shouldn't do that. That'd be too risky. So, is that your sense?
Let's go.
Okay. All right. So, and what I was going to do here, since we did, as Ben said, spend about an hour or more talking about the proposal in, I think it was October. I was going to focus this discussion on the element of the proposal that has changed since we first wrote the opinion, and that was on the what's called the energy assistance element of the proposal. Another way to frame this is the ways in which what the consequences of an RSE failure should be. Because this element is kind of addressing what was seen as a concern that RSE failure could lead to unnecessary reliability problems in an importing area if the imports were constrained, and imports into the area wouldn't necessarily have hurt anybody else. So that's sort of the element of the energy assistance. That's where the term comes from. But I want to frame this discussion in terms of kind of a higher level discussion about what the consequences of RSE failure should be, and just sort of recap again that this goes back to the question of why we have an RSE at all, and what it's supposed to accomplish. Last time we framed it as, as it's trying to prevent spillover, and there's sort of different ways to frame that, of scarcity, either in prices or in flexible capacity or in actual capacity. It's trying to prevent scarcity, spillover, as a consequence of participating in the EIM. And again, it's worth emphasizing this. A lot of people may be unhappy with one BAA's approach to resource adequacy or another, and there are effects to other markets regardless of whether they participate in EIM or not. And so this is specifically focused on the aspects of participating in EIM and the consequences of one BAA's lack of available capacity, how that might affect its neighbors. And one of the things we highlighted last time that I'll highlight again is that a lot of RSE failures, in fact, the majority of them, happen when prices are quite low. And so although the discussion of this topic has tended to focus on this scarcity element, because that was what motivated the RSE test in the first place, it's worth keeping in mind again that there are certainly relevant questions about what these consequences are during periods of non-scarcity, however you want to define that. All right, so that's all background, and I wanted to then sort of point out that the previous approach is what I would call a physical kind of paradigm. There are really these two paradigms to how to address RSE failure. And up till now, the EIM has taken what I would call a physical paradigm, which would either cap the import levels physically or in the market software, or indirectly cap them or penalize them within the market dispatch. So it would likely reduce the transfers or make them happen only in circumstances where true scarcity was happening on the receiving end. And that was the current approach is one of capping the physical transfers when RSE failures happen, and the previous proposal would have introduced this penalty into the market dispatch, which would have had the effect of really limiting transfers except in the most extreme price differential circumstances. All right, so we've moved away from that now with this new proposal into a different paradigm, which I would characterize as a financial only paradigm. And one consequence of this is that failure of the RSC will not affect the dispatch of the EIM anymore, for better or worse. And I do think there should be more exploration of whether it's better or worse, or the pros and cons of this, because there's a paradigmatic shift here that's happening from a physical paradigm to a financial one that implicitly relies upon financial penalties to as a deterrent mechanism to discourage BAAs from failing the RSE because they face financial consequences as a result of it. And I should say this isn't, there is some precedence for this approach to reliability. This is essentially the tool that NERC would use for things like ACE violations and other types of violations, largely because it doesn't really have any other options for it. But there is a sort of long history of applying financial penalties to BAAs who are seen after usually investigations and sort of determinations of the severity to various levels of financial consequences. Okay, so there are arguments, for and against both of these approaches, the physical approach and the financial approach, but I don't feel like the stakeholder process really explored that because we kind of fell into the ex post approach because of various objections to the previous physical endogenous to the market sort of proposals, many of them legitimate concerns, but as a result, we're sort of moving towards a financial paradigm here, which maybe is just a transitional thing, but I think it is an opportunity for the EIM community to kind of contemplate whether a financial approach is something that would be preferred over a physical approach. Now, if that is the preferred approach, there's certainly better ways to do it than I think this kind of current proposal, which really had to come together quickly and took elements of the previous proposal that were based upon a physical model and applied them to a financial model. So if we do, as a community, want to explore more this idea of a financial paradigm being the dominant element here, then I think there really does need to be deeper thought about several design elements, such as the dollar level of the penalties. We just took the $1,000, which was largely motivated by how that $1,000 would impact the market dispatch and would limit transfers only when there's true scarcity on one end. And we took that number and applied it to a new paradigm where it's not necessarily motivated by the same concerns. So the dollar level of the penalty, and I'm going to come back to this because we pointed out previously and still feel strongly that a single dollar value that applies under all market conditions is not appropriate and is very problematic. And so both the different levels and the overall levels of the penalty are something that deserve more thought as we go forward. The units of failure. How do we define failure? If we're thinking of this as sort of like a NERC-style financial penalty, is failure something that's measured primarily by the degree of the RSE failure, should be linked to the transfer megawatt hours, or some other metric that is linked to some kind of measure of the spillover effect of on reliability or of prices even of a failure to carry enough reserves or of this type of capacity? So I think those are all things that deserve probably more attention as we move forward, even if we pivot back to a physical paradigm. But I just wanted to make the observation that if we are relying on financial penalties to really be the primary tool to encourage behavior of a certain type, we want to think about when we're sending those financial penalties and if they are sufficient enough to induce the type of behavior we're trying to induce with the penalties. All right, all that as background, we want to point out a few sort of problems with the ex post penalty approach as implemented here. And it's largely that by decoupling the penalty from the market dispatch, we've got effects on both exporters and importers that are not necessarily desirable. On exporters, as sort of highlighted, we won't do anything to necessarily affect the dispatch, and therefore there is this potential they can't be exported into scarcity as the result of EIM dispatch, but they could be have their flexible capacity converted into transfers in a way that would leave them with less flexibility to deal with subsequent shocks that could happen. So you can tell, or you can imagine scenarios in which exporters would be left more vulnerable to shocks, certainly by an EIM dispatch that doesn't do anything about the RSE failures. And then on the other side, the importers could be harmed largely by this ex post approach because it does not incorporate the cost of the penalties into the decision to import or export. And so you could easily imagine circumstances where an importer is bringing in transfers that the market thinks are economic, but in fact are far from economic when one considers the $1,000 or $2,000 per megawatt hour penalty that might be applied to those same transfers. So normally we'd use bids to try to say, no, I don't want to buy power if it's going to cost $1,000. But because the penalties are outside of this market process, that sort of normal way of preventing it is not feasible. All right, so the ISO recognized, the CAISO recognized this, and there were a couple provisions to limit at least the megawatt magnitude to which the penalties could be applied. One was to revise this to be from being just focused on transfer quantities to being the minimum of the RSE failure amount or the transfer quantity. So if you fail by just a couple megawatts and the transfers are much bigger than that, then the logic behind this is that, well, it's a small RSE failure. It's not having a big negative reliability effect on neighbors, even though the transfers may be much larger. And there does seem to be some logic to that. I'd like to see this sort of further explored because this link to the megawatt failure is implicitly sort of saying that, well, we think that megawatt failures will be small when failures aren't really a big deal. And so therefore we're kind of creating a smaller exposure to penalties during periods when RSE megawatt failures are smaller. But data provided to us by the CAISO doesn't seem to indicate a very strong correlation between the magnitude of RSE failures for most BAAs and other metrics of scarcity like the market price in those BAAs. So there were plenty of instances where there were larger failures with lower prices and sometimes smaller failures at higher prices and so forth. So we didn't see a really strong link there. Which it still would limit the megawatt amount and would give BAAs an incentive to try to not only pass the RSE, but at least not fail it by larger amounts. So that is a positive incentive direction. The second element here is that available balancing capacity could also be used to offset part of the penalty. They could be used to offset the megawatt amount of the transfers part. My understanding is that it would not be used to offset the RSE megawatt failure element if that was the binding measure there. So that's something that non-CAISO BAAs that might carry this capacity outside of the market, by having that, it theoretically is providing the types of reliability capacity that the RSE was supposed to be checking for, and so there's some logic to allowing them to carry some credit for that. Although the downside of that is it might encourage them to shift capacity out of the EIM and into ABC, or at least not really penalize them for doing so, which has its own. We would like to see as much capacity. We'd like to see BAAs comfortable fully participating and not being incentivized to sort of keep stuff out for various concerns with how the EIM operates. So then I'll end with this was sort of all the downsides of ex post penalties. Of course, there were some strong reasons why they moved to this element. Some of them linked to how the CAISO itself has a issue with HASP and higher prices in HASP due to various factors and real time and other elements here. but we do discuss in the opinion, if we were going to do this sort of ex post penalty approach, that there are certainly some things we should take advantage of. And one of the things that the ex post approach does allow is a little more time to accurately measure things, the various things that we are theoretically concerned with, including calibrating the dollar value of the penalty to a measure of the severity of the penalty. And I think here, not less about the magnitude of the penalty, the magnitude of the megawatt deviation of a specific BAA, but more the market conditions in which the failure occurs. There are a lot of failures that are happening during periods in which it probably doesn't have any negative spillover effect on neighbors. And to apply the same $1,000 magnitude in those hours as we would in an hour where there is true risk of scarcity across multiple BAAs seems excessive and can lead to this sort of ex post, we're importing expensive power problem that could be addressed by simply having a penalty that's better calibrated to market conditions. That's something that's true no matter how we implement this penalty, whether it's physical or financial, and it's something we've been talking about throughout this process. Now with the ex post thing, we could also do a better job of calibrating this to the actual metered demand, or some measure of real-time demand rather than the forecast demand that's used when the RSE is evaluated. And then as we've noticed, or as we've learned from DMM and other explorations of the recent heat wave effect, there's a lot of complicated aspects to the RSE, and it seems like every time we go through a heat wave, we uncover a few more software flaws or other kind of unexpected design elements that really lead to misleading or just plain wrong RSE evaluation amounts. The treatment of various aspects of batteries that had depleted charges or state of charge restrictions was just one aspect that recent DMM analysis has highlighted from the previous last heat wave. So with the time to actually evaluate the severity of the failure, it does give the opportunity to essentially measure it correctly. And with that time, we might as well take advantage of it. One last thing I'll talk about that we do mention here as well is the link to the allocation of the costs of this penalty, which are proposed to be allocated to metered load, particularly in a BAA that has some element of retail choice or disaggregated retailing of any kind, disaggregated below the BAA level. That can really lead to some unfortunate incentives where there's a shared consequence of an RSE failure that may in fact be caused by only one load serving entity within a BAA being short, and other load serving entities that may be fully resourced would still have to bear the costs of these penalties. We do make the observation that trying to just link this to imbalance energy would be one way that seems more natural, that LSEs that cover themselves, at least in the day ahead market, would have the opportunity to avoid having to pay for these penalties. Now, there could certainly be circumstances where everybody's covered and there's still a need for transfers and RSE failures that wouldn't have enough imbalance load to allocate over, but it certainly seems like something that could be focused on. There are probably other elements here, but I do think just assigning it to metered load does create some incentive concerns there, as several stakeholders pointed out. So overall, like before, there were some issues with the current RSE that are, concerning, that should be adjusted. The other elements that I didn't talk about in this discussion having to do with the interaction of HASP and low priority transactions, some of which are still have some issues remaining, but I do believe are a step forward. Here, I believe, at least there are opportunities now for BAAs to avoid having their imports unnecessarily capped during periods where they did have an RSE failure, if there are willing sellers of energy out there. But there are some other consequences that are that are concerning here. I didn't mention that they will still have the option to stick with the status quo RSE approach. We, not to put words in anybody's mouth, but we sort of expect that because of the shortcomings I've been discussing, that many BAAs will probably stick with the status quo RSE penalty approach, at least during periods in which there isn't likely to be scarcity looming. And so maybe this won't be as consequential, but also won't be as consequential in the positive direction either, because so many folks will end up kind of just following the status quo. So like Scott said with the battery stuff, there's a lot more work to be done here. I think there's some clear kind of improvements that maybe just need some stakeholder discussion, like the level of the penalties. I haven't really heard a serious objection to having lower penalties during periods in which there isn't scarcity. It just seemed to be running out of time to sort of reach some stakeholder consensus, or at least willingness to set different levels. And so those things ideally would be dealt with as we move forward. And I'll stop there and let the others fill in what I've missed.
Nothing to add. Scott.
Jim, that was very clear and thorough. Thank you. I have nothing to add. So, Michelle, we can see if there's any questions or comments on the phone lines.
There are currently no questions in queue.
Okay. That being the case, Jim, you really did a very thorough job. There's nothing that anybody can say after that. Thank you. So let's then proceed to consideration of the adoption of the opinion. So let's see, let me get the precise title of the opinion. Well, I'll just say the resource sufficiency evaluation proposal. We have a draft opinion that was posted yesterday, and I will entertain a motion to adopt it.
I move to adopt the opinion.
Second.
Okay. Dr. Bushnell moved to adopt, and Dr. Harvey seconded. Is there any further discussion, amendments? Anything else anybody wants to say?
Not from Scott.
Nope.
Okay. I suspect that just like energy storage enhancements, this opinion is about issues that we will be revisiting in the future, either in the context of the real-time EIM market, or in the context of the extended day-ahead market proposal, in terms of the effectiveness of incentives, as well as inefficiencies that can result if they are misdirected. And in particular, looking forward in the future, talking about more finely tuned financial consequences that are reflective of system conditions. But any rate, I think we're ready then to vote. And so, Jim?
I vote yes.
Scott?
Vote yes.
And I also vote yes. So the opinion and resource sufficiency evaluation has been unanimously adopted. Thanks again for all your work over the past few months. Actually, the past years, we considered the issues here. And thank you to the stakeholders for attending. And our last agenda item is any future business. I'll just point out that we have MSC meetings on the upcoming, next 2 Mondays, on day ahead market enhancements and the enhanced day ahead market. And so looking forward to hearing from many of you then. Does anybody else have any other business? If so, I hope the sun is still shining in Sacramento, the sun we saw shining on Danny's shirt. It is not definitely not shining here on the East Coast. Looking forward to seeing you all next Monday then. So Michelle, we're all done. We can disconnect the phone lines.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.